The American dream is a shifting term that describes the ideal life of the middle class, and it changes with each iteration of the culture it represents. At this point in history, the basic cultural definition of the word is, to many people, having a place to live, food to eat, and the opportunity to advance. It is more about having consistent employment than working for yourself, though we all seem to dream of being in charge. It's about getting married and having a car and getting a vote and having kids to carry on your legacy, whatever you make of it. It's about having enough to make it after retirement, and then, in our final days, having enough to leave something behind for the ones that we love. Most of all, it's about having the necessary opportunity to get all of these things, but perhaps not always the chance. It's about having the freedom to pursue this dream, unless the dream involves breaking any laws. This was not the way it was always, though. In fact, the American dream has changed tremendously over the last century. It's also interesting to note that the specific term, the American dream, was only coined in 1931. Even though, since it's been given a name, it is clearly visible, stretching to the origins of our country. There was always an American dream which people came to America for, even before we had formally codified it in that sense. The American dream itself was a product of the inherently pro-socialistic progressive movement that brought us out of the Great Depression and gave us New Deal politics that changed the world for many and saved a lot of people from crippling poverty and starvation. And in the 1940s, when my grandparents, born in the beginning of the Roaring '20s, were in the prime of their life, their American dream was more about self-sufficiency. For example, they built their house from the ground up, with my uncles running up the wiring by hand. Even though this trend had begun to fade with the numerous prefabricated houses that would be coming in the 50s. Owning a car would become affordable enough that it would be a part of the dream as well. And these two things were made possible by increasing cultural acceptance of taking loans, as a means of buying increasingly expensive items that it would be impractical to save up for. At this time, a woman had a very different dream from her male counterpart, though. Employment was continuing to creep into it as a change from maybe some farm or housework. African Americans were now included in this dream, but to them it was still a very different world, because at the time they were still not nearly able to grasp all of the things that gave the European Americans access to the opportunity that had historically allowed them to succeed. This is also the pre-civil rights era, and it's an era where there was still Jim Crow active in the South. So in a lot of ways, while this may be the most appealing, it's also deliberately only extended to white men and their beneficiaries. The 1950s brought us what was possibly the clearest image of the American dream, because it was marketed to us through mass media culture and television in a way that had never even been possible before. The American dream was a steady, good-paying job that could support a wife, 2 kids, and a dog, that would allow you to be able to afford mortgage payments, to buy a car, in addition to the many other freedoms that had been considered a part of the American dream before. This is probably the most appealing version of the American dream that has ever existed in popular culture, and it is often one that most people think about going back to when they talk about things like making America great again. However, when we talk about those things, we also need to acknowledge that there were some very important milestones for freedom that have happened since the 1950s, such as women having the ability to go into the job market and become self-sufficient by way of having an employer and competitive wages. And while that still isn't the same type of self-sufficiency that I've talked about in other parts of this video, it is very much important for women's independence from their families and from men. At least in some part, that was about to change. While the African American community didn't have much in the way of opportunities in the 1940s and 1950s, they did at least have some level of freedom. In the 1960s, it was Dr. Martin Luther King who would again change the definition of the dream. By the end of the Civil Rights Movement in the beginning of the 1970s, it was now clear that people of color should have access to opportunity in America. And with the stroke of a pen, it was written into law, and eventually our hearts, that this form of opportunity and equality should be the core of the new American dream. Today we hold those ideals, but much has changed. It seems like to me since the 1950s we've been trading away that level of freedom that was then extended to white men for more and more of a free market. And the reason that I use the scare quotes there is because this isn't the same kind of free market that I've discussed before. The idea is heavily influenced by the objectivist ideas of Ayn Rand and thinkers like Milton Friedman that have come after her. This is the idea that deregulation of capitalist industry is all that we need for the system to operate correctly. Because after all, Adam Smith said, all we need is the invisible hand. End of book. This doesn't really seem to look at what the invisible hand is, what makes it feasible. It simply posits that removing regulation will make everything better for reasons. This is a freedom that only exists for capitalists. And for the rest of us, those who don't profit from these changes, we actually see a reduction in freedoms. We begin to lose freedoms to have a single income household while supporting children, so that both parents now have to work full time, and no one has time to actually raise their offspring. In many places in America, we've lost the freedom to unionize and collectivize, and that negotiation that Adam Smith was talking about between the laborer and the capitalist, or the capitalist and the consumer, doesn't really happen at all anymore. Part of the problem is this libertarian focus on corporate personhood, and the idea that they too have rights that seem to often override our own. For more on the role of American courts in creating this very 20th century idea of what a corporation is, I again give you Enzo from Sustainable Justice.
Following the Civil War, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law to everybody born in US soil. As they do, the capitalist class exploited this amendment for a profit. Namely, they argued in court that their corporations were no less deserving of human rights than were former slaves. This was one of the central issues in Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad. Interestingly though, the court never decided whether corporations are people or not, but the public was told otherwise. This lie influenced much of the 20th century pro-business jurisprudence, and we even see it today in cases such as Citizens United, which allow corporations free speech rights to donate money to political candidates. If you want to see me discuss this issue more in depth, check out my video on the matter. I'll be waiting for you there.
We have lost so many of the freedoms and so much of the power that we may have once had to be able to take on corporate powers head to head in the market. And because of that, so much of what the American dream was, for many, there seems to be almost no American dream left for the majority. For some of us, there's this idea of egalitarianism creating a better country, but frankly, without fixing these other economic problems, that would just make us all equally fucked by the system, as it increasingly morphs into a monopolistic oligarchy. So I guess maybe the American dream is over. We're all woke now. We've been woke for so long that we've forgotten what the American dream is really like. Some of us even see that it was mostly just lies and marketing to begin with. A dream that was planted in our heads. And so we entered a state where only the capitalist investor class had any freedom left, and the markets are tightly controlled by a few instead of being free. And we have forgotten our own American dream. As of 2008, we've plunged into an economic crisis that rivals the Depression of the 30s, that had for so long wired self-sufficiency into the American dream, and drove us in a politically populist direction. We have watched as our dream has become diminished. We hope to own a home, but renting is acceptable. We take the car we can afford. We desire a good job, but we're on the whole grateful just to have one. By now, at least for the younger generations, having access to a college-level education is part of that dream as well. The sexes and the races of America are not completely equal. We're possibly getting closer to that every year. Day by day, groups demand for newer, broader definitions of this shared dream. Homosexuals ask for the respect and opportunity to get married. Protesters in the streets ask for defense from corporate interests, and ask for a living wage, healthcare, and access to higher education. These people are now the vehicle of change in American culture. These are the faces who will change this dream for the next generation. And that is the mercurial nature of the American dream. What was relevant to us only 50 years ago now seems like only a passing dream that we are slowly waking up from. At this point in history, the cultural definition of the phrase seems to be having a place to live, food to eat, and the opportunity to advance. But it is no longer a wife waiting for you at home like in some fantasies for 1950s sitcom paradise, because she's at work too, and increasingly working even more hours than her husband. But it seems that even the two of them can only manage to do what a single provider type husband could have done with his salary in the black and white mid-century still frames in my mind. We did not build our house, or even see it built, most likely. Cars are now a necessity, not a luxury. The number of protesters in the streets is as high as during peace movements and the civil rights movement, and their voices are slowly creeping into the mainstream. And while there are a lot of things to protest about, there are a lot of things to be proud of as well. After all, part of the American dream is never giving up. So what is freedom? I would say that freedom is the ability to act without interference and restrictions, and that it is important to give our citizens freedom above all else. Too often the conversation gets hung up in what businesses are free to do, and often allowing business more and more freedom in this way just leads to the increased victimization of their customers, which again have no bargaining power to negotiate the prices that they pay. Just as you could ask how a nation that condones slavery could ironically call itself the land of the free, we must ask ourselves, if we imprison so much of America for nonviolent crimes, are we really free even now? And if you still don't have the same opportunities because of your name, sex, gender, skin color, orientation, can you really consider yourself to be free? I don't care what is theoretically possible in the system. I care how it works in practice. Yes, I could possibly win the lottery and possibly be able to make more of my dreams come true now that I'm able to fund things that have had to remain dreams my entire life. But if the means to do so are statistically impossible, how is that freedom? Is the freedom to choose to starve over wage theft truly freedom? Or is the ability to pursue the life you want without worrying about your own starvation? Is that freedom? I think that's a fundamental choice that we're going to have to make, and I think that we need to start making it right now. I think freedom is the ability to pursue life, liberty, and happiness to one's heart's content, but that it does not give us the right to collectivize as corporations in order to take away the freedoms of the individual for our own personal gain. There is a bit of balancing that has to be done between the business and the individual. And I feel that one of the systems that best accomplishes this is to allow the worker more democratic rights in terms of determining how a business operates. And I'm supportive of really any means to that end, whether it be worker-owned co-ops or collectivization through unions. But ultimately, I believe that the rights and freedoms of the individual 100% of the time come ahead of the rights and freedoms of businesses, big enterprise, and especially corporations. And that is where I differ as an anarchist from a libertarian, in that I do not think that corporations are people or should be treated as such under the law, because I think that doing so leads to a very real loss of rights for the individual. And it's funny because the libertarians often like to tout the non-aggression principle, where you should have the freedom to do anything that doesn't encroach on someone else's freedoms or call for violence against them. Well, there are a lot of freedoms and personal liberties and a lot of violence that is committed against the consumer and against the people that cannot afford to be consumers for whatever reason.